He thought he was buying an abandoned farm, only to find 3 women who never left, fighting to protect their family's land from a ruthless bank's lies. What started as a simple purchase soon shattered everything he believed, dragging him into a web of deceit, danger, and unexpected alliances. Before you watch, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling tales. Now, saddle up and dive into a story of betrayal, courage, and the fight for justice in the Wild West. The wind was sharp that morning, carrying with it the dry scent of dust and pine from the high ridge to the west. I'd been riding for the better part of 3 days, the deed folded neatly inside my coat pocket, its edges worn from my own hands checking it over and over again along the way. The bank in Carson City had assured me the property was abandoned, nothing but empty buildings and weathered fence posts waiting for someone with enough grit to make it their own again. I'd paid in full cash, because that was the condition, and I'd left with a sense of victory, imagining the start of something new. From the hilltop, I could see the place stretched out before me, a weathered farmhouse, a leaning barn, the skeletal remains of an old corral. At least, that's what I expected. Instead, I saw a thin trail of smoke curling up from the chimney. There were 3 horses tied to the fence post out front, their coats groomed, their tack well cared for. And there was movement, small, quick shapes near the garden beside the house. The garden itself was thriving, green leaves shimmering in the light breeze, neat rows of vegetables that spoke of regular care. Chickens scratched in the dirt inside a pen that was sturdier than most corrals I'd seen in this territory. The place wasn't just lived in, it was alive, tended, and cared for. My first thought was that squatters had moved in after the bank repossessed the land. My second was that the bank's idea of abandoned was dangerously loose. I pushed my horse forward, curiosity giving way to unease. The closer I got, the more the signs of occupation piled up. Laundry hung from a rope strung between 2 oak trees. Fresh boot prints marked the path to the front porch. Even the barn door had been recently repaired, new boards bright against the older wood. I reined in a few yards from the porch and swung down from the saddle. That's when I saw them, 3 women standing just inside the doorway, watching me with eyes that didn't blink. The one in front was tall, her dark hair pulled back tight, her stance steady in a way that made me think she was used to being listened to. Behind her stood 2 others, one with hair like burnished copper catching the sunlight, the other fair-haired with a softness to her face that didn't reach her eyes. In that moment, the sense of victory I'd carried from Carson City turned into something colder. They weren't startled to see me. They weren't confused. They were defensive, as if my arrival had been expected, as if they'd dealt with this before. I thought about the bank's words, abandoned, no claimants, sold as is. But these women didn't look like people passing through. They looked like they belonged here, like the soil itself might rise up to defend them if I made the wrong move. I've been in enough tight spots to recognize when I'm standing in one. The air between us was heavy, and though not a single word had passed, I knew something was wrong. The kind of wrong that doesn't come from misunderstandings. It comes from someone, somewhere, telling a lie big enough to drag you miles out of your way and right into trouble. I could have turned around right then, ridden back to town, and demanded answers. But there was a stubborn streak in me that didn't take kindly to the idea of being played for a fool. And besides, I'd already paid for this land. Every dollar I had was tied up in it. So I stepped forward, closing the space between me and the 3 pairs of watchful eyes, and in that moment I made a choice I'd come to both regret and be grateful for. I decided to find out exactly what was going on, no matter how deep the rot went. What I didn't know then was that the rot reached farther than I could imagine, that it wound through the local bank, into the sheriff's office, even into the pockets of men who called themselves judges. And before this was over, I'd be standing in the middle of a fight that had been brewing for years, with these 3 women as the only allies I could count on. That day on the porch was the first time I saw the fire in their eyes. I didn't realize it yet, but it was the same fire that would see us through ambushes, betrayals, and the kind of danger you can't outrun. The fire that would keep us alive when the rest of the territory was betting against us. The first step onto that porch felt heavier than it should have, like the wood beneath me was testing my right to be there. The tall woman in front didn't move aside, didn't soften her gaze, and I realized then that introductions here weren't going to be as simple as giving my name and showing a deed. I stopped a few feet away, close enough to see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the way the sunlight caught in the strands of loose hair that had escaped her braid. She studied me like a rancher studies a coyote, measuring whether I was just passing through or if I meant trouble. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sounds were the restless snort of my horse behind me and the faint cluck of the chickens in the yard. Then she finally said, her voice low and deliberate, "You're a long way from anywhere that's got business with you." I kept my tone even. "Bought this place from the bank in Carson City. Deeds in my pocket." I tapped the side of my coat, not taking my eyes off hers. "They told me it was abandoned." That drew the faintest twitch of a smile. Not amusement, but something sharper, like she'd just heard a bad joke she'd been expecting all along. "They've been selling this land to strangers for years," she said. "None of them stay long." I wanted to ask why, but something in her voice told me the answer wouldn't come cheap. The copper-haired woman behind her shifted her weight, glancing toward the barn, and the blonde one kept her gaze on me like she was trying to memorize my face. "Name's Elias Carter," I said finally, figuring if we were going to stand here circling each other with words, I might as well start somewhere. "If you've got a claim on this place, now's the time to say so." The tall woman stepped forward just enough for the light to hit her eyes. They were the kind of eyes that had seen too much, steady, unblinking, with a hint of something buried deep that no stranger could touch. "Name's Miriam," she said. "And no, we don't have papers. But we've been here longer than anyone you've spoken to in that city." She let the words hang there, a challenge wrapped in truth. I thought about what the bank manager had said, about repossessions, unpaid taxes, and the unfortunate state of rural properties. But now, with Miriam standing in front of me, it was clear none of that told the whole story. These women weren't squatters in the usual sense. They belonged here in a way I couldn't yet understand. "Place is mine now," I said, the words tasting like dry iron in my mouth. "That's not a threat, it's just fact. Whatever's going on here, I'm not leaving without the truth." Miriam's gaze didn't waver. "Then you'd best come inside." The air shifted as she stepped back, giving me room to cross the threshold. The interior was cleaner than I'd expected, wood floors swept, a small fire crackling in the hearth, shelves lined with jars of preserved vegetables. A table sat in the center of the room, its surface worn smooth by years of use, and on it lay a long knife, the blade freshly oiled. The copper-haired woman moved past me to stand near the kitchen, while the blonde closed the door behind me, the latch clicking into place with a sound that felt more final than it should have. "You've got a right to hear it," Miriam said, motioning toward the table. "But understand, once you know, you won't be able to walk away easy." I sat, the chair legs scraping softly against the floor. She stayed standing, hands resting on the back of the opposite chair, as if she needed the distance. "This land," she began, "used to belong to the Red Elk family, Apache. They kept to themselves, farmed the valley, traded fair with the townsfolk. But 15 years ago, the county surveyor decided this property wasn't theirs to keep. Claimed the deed from their grandfather was never filed proper. Bank took it, sold it to a cattleman from Reno. That man lasted 3 months before he turned up in the creek, throat cut. After that, the place went through 8 more owners in as many years. Fires, accidents, sickness, you name it. Folks stopped trying." I leaned back, studying her. "And you 3. "We were here before the last man left," Miriam said. "His barn burned down one night. He packed up and never came back. Left half his things. We stayed." The copper-haired one finally spoke, her voice softer but edged. "We stayed because leaving isn't an option. Not for us." Something about the way she said it made my skin prickle. I'd heard men in mining camps talk about curses, about land that didn't want new owners. I'd never put much stock in it. But here, with the light filtering through the windows and the air carrying a weight I couldn't name, it didn't seem so far-fetched. "You think there's something out here keeping folks from staying?" I asked. Miriam's jaw tightened. We don't think, Mr. Carter. We know. Before I could press her, the blonde, who still hadn't given her name, moved to the window and peered out toward the ridge. Her shoulders stiffened. They're back, she said. Miriam's eyes flicked to me, then back to the blonde. How many? 2 riders. Same as before. My pulse quickened. Friends of yours? No, Miriam said flatly. And not of yours either, if you're smart. Without another word, she crossed the room and pulled a rifle from a rack near the hearth. The copper-haired woman fetched a second from behind the kitchen door. The blonde didn't move from the window, tracking the approach of the riders with the focus of a hawk. You can sit there, Miriam said to me, or you can help. But if you help, you're in this. All the way. I thought about the deed in my pocket, about the miles I'd ridden to get here. Walking away now would mean more than losing my investment. It would mean letting someone else write the end of the story. And I've never been one to hand over the pen. I'll help, I said. The corner of Miriam's mouth lifted. Not in approval, but in acknowledgement, like she'd just confirmed a suspicion. She tossed me a spare rifle, the metal cool and solid in my hands. We stepped out onto the porch as the riders came into view, dust rising behind their horses. Both wore long coats, hats pulled low, their faces shadowed. But even from a distance, I could see the way they sat their saddles, loose, confident, the way men ride when they think no one can touch them. Miriam didn't call out a greeting. She just stood there, the rifle balanced in her hands, and waited. The copper-haired woman moved to my left, the blonde to my right, all 3 of them forming a line with me in the middle. The riders slowed as they reached the gate, stopping just short of the fence. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a scar running from jaw to ear, tipped his hat back enough for me to catch his eyes. Cold, pale, and utterly without humor. Afternoon, he said, voice carrying across the yard. Didn't know the place had company. Does now, Miriam replied. The man's gaze shifted to me. You new here. Bought the place from the bank, I said. Name's Elias Carter. He chuckled, low and mean. That so? Well, Mr. Carter, you might want to ask your new friends what happens to folks who try to settle here. I already did, I said. Didn't scare me off. The man's smile thinned. We'll see. He turned his horse, the other rider following without a word, and they headed back the way they came. We watched them go, the dust from their departure hanging in the air long after they were gone. Miriam lowered her rifle. They'll be back, she said quietly. And next time, they won't just be talking. I didn't know it yet, but she was right. That was the first time I saw the faces of the men who'd make it their mission to drive us off this land. And it was far from the last. By the 3rd day, the rhythm of this place had begun to seep into my bones, though it was not the kind of rhythm that brought peace. It was more like the quiet before a storm, measured, deliberate, but with something restless crouching just beneath the surface. The 3 women kept to their routines with uncanny precision. At dawn, the copper-haired one slipped out to tend the garden and check the perimeter of the property. She carried herself with the awareness of someone who had learned to notice changes that most would miss. Fresh tracks in the dirt, the shift of a shadow where no shadow should be. The tall dark-haired one managed the barn and the livestock, her movements deliberate and efficient. She never lingered in one place long enough for anyone to study her too closely, yet there was no wasted step. The fair-haired woman was rarely seen outside for long. She worked mostly inside the house, and whenever I caught sight of her through the windows, she was sorting, packing, and moving things as if ready to vanish at a moment's notice. The strange thing was, none of them spoke to me. Not a word, not a nod. It was as if my presence had been quietly acknowledged but never welcomed. Meals appeared on the table in the evenings, plain but filling, and no one sat across from me. Dishes vanished by morning. There was a system here, one that ran without my participation, and I was left to hover at its edges, like an intruder allowed inside the walls but never into the heart of the place. I spent my time trying to learn the layout, walking the land I supposedly owned. The boundaries stretched farther than I expected, into a stand of thick pines where the air was cooler and the ground was soft underfoot. There was an old trail leading deeper into the trees, almost hidden under years of pine needles, but the cuts in the earth told me it had once been well traveled. I followed it far enough to find the remnants of a stone structure, half buried under moss and dirt. Whatever it had been, it was older than the farmhouse, and the silence around it was heavier, as though the forest itself was guarding its secrets. The unease grew with each discovery. There were signs of activity far beyond the house and barn, faded scorch marks on stones, faint carvings in tree trunks, even a section of earth near the creek that looked as though it had been dug up recently and hastily filled in again. None of it fit the picture of an abandoned property sold to a stranger with cash in his pocket. That night, I woke to the sound of hoofbeats in the distance. They weren't the steady, aimless wander of grazing horses. They were urgent, purposeful. I stayed still, listening. The beats grew louder, closer, then stopped abruptly somewhere near the barn. A minute later, I heard footsteps, human, light but hurried. Then the creak of the barn door, followed by silence so complete it made the hair on my arms stand up. I waited for someone to emerge, but no one did. Instead, the quiet stretched on, broken only by the occasional groan of the wind through the rafters. When I finally stepped out onto the porch, the night was empty. The barn door was closed again, and the 3 horses tied outside earlier in the week were gone. By morning, there was no sign anything had happened at all. The copper-haired woman was in the garden, the dark-haired one tending the barn, the fair-haired one moving through the house. If they noticed my watching, they didn't let it show. But I caught the smallest shift in the way the dark-haired one glanced toward the hills beyond the property. Quick, sharp, and too knowing to be casual. The more I observed, the clearer it became that this land was more than just a patch of soil and wood. It was a meeting point, a crossroads of some kind. People came and went under the cover of darkness, and though I hadn't seen them directly, the tracks and subtle changes around the property told the story. Supplies appeared in the barn that hadn't been there the day before. Barrels of fresh water, sacks of grain, crates sealed tight and stacked neatly in the shadows. And yet, through it all, the women carried on as if nothing was unusual. They had built their lives inside a pattern that was invisible to anyone who didn't know how to look. I didn't know yet if I was meant to be part of that pattern, or if I was simply another variable they had to account for until they decided what to do with me. I began to keep my own watch. At night, I stayed awake longer, moving quietly through the house, noting which doors were locked and which were left open. I found a room at the end of the hall with a heavy latch on the outside, as if meant to keep something, or someone, in. Inside, there was nothing but an empty bed frame and a single lantern hanging from a hook. The floorboards bore deep scratches near the door, as if someone had once tried to claw their way out. That image stayed with me long after I closed the door again. It added a new weight to my steps, a new calculation to every choice I made. This was no simple matter of a disputed property. Whatever the truth was, it had teeth, and it was waiting for me to step too close. Still, I stayed. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was the slow pull of curiosity, or maybe it was the sense that walking away now would leave something unfinished, a question unanswered. I'd seen enough of this territory to know that some questions, once asked, had a way of following you, gnawing at the back of your mind until you turned to face them. And so I watched, I waited, and I listened. I traced the edges of their routines, tested the boundaries of their silence. I began to learn the small signals they gave each other. Barely a tilt of the head, a flick of the hand, a look that carried more weight than words ever could. Theirs was a language built in shadows, and I was determined to learn it. What I didn't realize was that every step I took toward understanding was also a step deeper into something I wouldn't be able to walk away from. The lines between my land, their home, and the territory beyond were blurring, and soon I wouldn't just be a witness. I would be part of whatever was coming, whether I chose it or not. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm I hadn't planned for, each one pulling me deeper into the life of the farm and the mystery behind its keepers. At first, my presence was treated like a storm that might pass, something to be endured until it blew itself out. The 3 women spoke to me sparingly, and only when necessary. Meals were taken at separate times, and the sound of footsteps in the hallways seemed to fade whenever I approached. Still, every morning, I saddled my horse and made a slow circuit of the property, getting to know the lay of the land that I had, at least on paper, bought outright. The more I saw, the less sense it made. For a place supposedly abandoned, the farm ran like a well-oiled machine. Fences were mended before they broke, water troughs scrubbed clean before algae could take hold, fields weeded and turned in precise rows. Someone had been here a long time, long enough to understand the rhythm of the land, long enough for the land to bend to their will. It was on the fourth morning, while walking the southern edge of the pasture, that I found something that sent a chill through me despite the heat. Half buried in the grass was a rusted tin box, its surface dented and scored. Inside, beneath a layer of dirt, were folded papers, water-damaged but still legible. The handwriting was hurried, scrawled across scraps of ledger pages and torn envelopes. Each one was dated, and each one carried the same name at the bottom, Harlan Briggs. I didn't know the name, but I knew the type. Every note spoke of promises, threats, and arrangements to keep certain men away from the property. There were mentions of the sheriff, of disputes settled quietly, and of payments made in coin and in kind. The more I read, the more I understood that this land had been sitting on top of a nest of vipers for years. When I brought the box back to the house, Clara, the tall one, took it from my hands without a word. She read every paper without flinching, though her jaw tightened with each new page. When she finally looked up, her eyes were sharp enough to cut glass. "You didn't see this," she said flatly. I started to protest, but she stepped closer, her voice low. "I mean it. You didn't see it. You didn't read it. And you'll forget where you found it." Her words were less a request and more an order, the kind that comes from someone used to being obeyed. I held her gaze a long moment, then nodded. But the truth was, I couldn't forget even if I wanted to. That night, I didn't sleep much. The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of riders in the distance. Hoofbeats, slow and deliberate, somewhere beyond the ridge. I stood at the window, watching the horizon until the sound faded. When dawn broke, the tracks were there, fresh and deep, leading from the ridge toward the river, then doubling back. Whoever they were, they'd been circling, watching. By the sixth day, my role here had shifted without me realizing it. I was no longer just the outsider with the deed in his pocket. I was the man patching fences alongside the copper-haired one, Rose, who spoke little but worked harder than anyone I'd seen. I was the one hauling water to the garden while the fair-haired woman, Elsie, harvested beans with quick, precise hands. Clara stayed close to the house, but her eyes followed everything, calculating, measuring. The air grew heavier with each passing day, the kind of tension that makes your skin itch. We all felt it, though no one spoke of it outright. Then, on the seventh night, the storm broke. I'd gone to the barn to check on my horse before turning in. The lantern light swung in the breeze as I stepped inside, and froze. Two men stood in the shadows, their coats dusty, their hats pulled low. The one nearest me smiled without warmth. "You're the new owner," he said, voice like gravel. "That's what the papers say," I replied, keeping my hand near the pitchfork leaning against the stall. He nodded toward the house. "Place like this don't change hands without arrangements. You understand." I understood enough to know this wasn't a casual visit. Before I could answer, the taller man stepped forward, the lamplight catching the scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. "Harlan Briggs sends his regards," he said. "And his warning." The message was clear. Whatever I thought I owned, it came with strings, and those strings were held by men who weren't afraid to tighten them around my neck. They left as quietly as they'd come, but their presence lingered long after the sound of hooves faded. When I returned to the house, Clara was waiting at the door. She didn't ask what they'd said. She already knew. "You should leave," she told me, her voice low but steady, "before you find yourself buried under the same dirt that covers the last man who tried to claim this land." I thought about her words, about the box of letters, about the riders in the night. And then I thought about the stubborn streak that had brought me here in the first place. I'm not going anywhere, I said. For a long moment, she just looked at me, as if measuring the weight of my resolve against the danger it invited. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. Then you'd better be ready, she said. Because they'll come back. And next time, they won't be bringing warnings. The warning the two strangers left behind didn't drift away like dust in the wind. It hung in the air, thick and heavy, seeping into every hour of the day. The women didn't speak of it directly, but I could see it in their movements. They shut doors more quietly, kept the lanterns low after sundown, took longer pauses when working outside, scanning the tree line as if expecting something, or someone, to step out of it. I tried to keep my routine unchanged, though that was easier said than done. A man can't forget the sound of hoofbeats that come in the dark or the cold certainty in a stranger's eyes when they speak your name without you ever giving it. I started keeping my rifle closer. Not slung over the wall by the hearth, but propped up within arm's reach. The first 3 days after the visit passed without incident. That's the cruelest trick danger plays. It lets you believe it might have moved on, gives you just enough quiet to lower your guard. But the land had gone too still. Not the kind of peace that means safety, but the kind that means something is coiling up in the shadows, waiting to strike. It happened just after sundown on the 4th day. I was in the barn, fixing a broken latch, when a sharp crack split the air. Gunfire, close enough to make the horses rear in their stalls. My first thought was that it came from the east pasture. My second thought was that I'd left the women at the house. I grabbed the rifle and ran, boots pounding the hard earth. By the time I reached the front porch, Rose was there, a shotgun in her hands, her copper hair loose and wild around her face. Elsie was crouched behind the porch rail, eyes scanning the dark beyond the fence line. Clara stood in the doorway, revolver drawn, calm as if she'd been waiting for this moment all her life. "They're testing us," Clara said without looking at me. "Finding their range." The second shot came from the opposite side of the property, followed by the faint echo of laughter. Whoever they were, they weren't aiming to hit, yet. They wanted to rattle us, to remind us that the land wasn't ours, no matter what the deed said. We waited, tense and silent, until the darkness swallowed the sounds. Then came the real trouble. The smell of smoke reached us first, faint, but growing stronger by the second. Rose was the first to spot it. A thin line of orange licking up from the hay shed on the far side of the barn. "They're burning us out," she shouted, already moving. I went with her, rifle ready, the heat of the fire building against my face as we neared the shed. Shadows danced in the light, 2 men on horseback, one tossing a burning bundle into the open doorway, the other holding a pistol low at his side. "Drop it!" I yelled, raising my rifle. One of them turned, saw me, and spurred his horse hard. The other fired once, the shot whistling past my head, close enough to hear the air tear. I squeezed the trigger. My shot missed, but it was enough to make him pull back and wheel away. They disappeared into the dark, the thunder of their hooves fading into the hills. We spent the next hour beating back the fire, coughing through the smoke until the last ember died. The shed was half gone, the hay inside a blackened ruin. It could have been worse. We still had the barn, the house, and the livestock, but the message was clear. This was only the beginning. Back inside, with the windows shuttered and the lantern turned low, Clara poured 3 fingers of whiskey into a glass and handed it to me. "They'll be back," she said simply. "I know," I answered, taking a slow drink. "They'll come harder next time. And they won't just go for the buildings." Her meaning was plain enough, but I didn't look at the women. I didn't want to imagine the shapes that threat might take. Rose spoke up for the first time in hours, her voice tight. "We can't just wait for them to choose the time." Elsie nodded. "We take it to them." Clara's eyes narrowed, studying both of them before landing on me. "You came here thinking you were buying a piece of land. What you bought was a war. Question is, are you willing to fight it?" I didn't answer right away. I thought of the strangers in the barn, of the smoke rising against the night sky, of the papers in that tin box and the name Harlan Briggs scrawled across them. I thought of the stubborn streak that had brought me here, and the part of me that now refused to run. "I'll fight," I said finally. "But we do it on our terms." That night, we drew up plans at the kitchen table, marking the property lines, the ridges, the choke points where a small force could hold off a larger one. I'd seen my share of fights, but something about this one was different. This wasn't about honor or revenge. It was about survival. When I finally went to bed, the house was quiet, but not with the silence of peace. It was the stillness before the next move, the deep breath before the plunge. Somewhere out in the dark, I knew the riders were waiting too. And when they came again, it wouldn't be with warnings or fire, it would be to finish what they'd started. Dawn came thin and gray, the kind of light that feels like it's struggling to break through something heavier than clouds. I was already outside when it arrived, walking the fence line with my rifle in one hand, coffee steaming in the other. I hadn't slept much. None of us had. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind through the eaves, had sounded like the start of something. The air was cool, but the stillness carried weight. No birdsong. No distant rustle of cattle. Just the faint hum of the earth holding its breath. I reached the north pasture when I saw it, a single boot print in the soft earth by the fence. Too fresh for my liking. Kneeling down, I traced it with my fingers, noting the size and the sharp cut of the heel. Whoever it was, they'd been watching from just beyond the tree line, close enough to see the barn and the front porch. I followed the prints as far as I dared without leaving the property, stopping where the grass gave way to a narrow deer path. From there, the trail disappeared into the pines. That was no accident. They wanted us to know they'd been here, but not where they'd gone. By the time I made it back to the house, Clara was waiting on the porch. She had that same expression she'd worn the night of the fire. Calm, but with a spark behind her eyes like a storm ready to break. "They're circling," I said. "I know," she replied. "And I think I know who's leading them." She motioned for me to follow her inside. On the kitchen table lay an old map of the county, yellowed and creased from years of folding. Several spots were marked in red pencil: homesteads, abandoned mines, and a river crossing to the east. "Harlan Briggs," Clara said, tapping one of the marks. "Used to run cattle through this valley. Lost most of his land when the railroad came through. Blamed my father for it." Rose, leaning against the wall, added, "Word is, he's been taking it back, piece by piece. Folks who didn't sell to him outright just disappeared." "And the law?" I asked. Clara gave me a look that said more than words. "In Briggs' pocket." It was one thing to have faceless riders in the night. It was another to put a name to them, and to know that name came with money, guns, and men who didn't mind getting blood on their boots. By midday, we'd set a trap. I took up position in the loft of the barn, rifle sight trained on the western approach. Rose hid near the shed with the shotgun, while Elsie kept watch from the upstairs bedroom window. Clara stayed on the porch, a visible lure for anyone who thought she might be alone. The wait was long. The sun climbed high, then began its slow descent, throwing long shadows across the yard. Just when I began to think we might be wrong, I caught movement through the scope. 4 riders breaking from the tree line, moving slow and easy like they owned the place. The man in front wore a long duster and a black hat pulled low. Even from a distance, I could see the scar running from his left ear down to his jaw. I didn't need Clara to tell me. It was Briggs. They stopped just short of the fence. Briggs dismounted, walking forward with his hands loose at his sides. He had the kind of confidence that comes from never hearing the word no. "Afternoon," he called, his voice carrying across the yard. "You've got something that belongs to me." Clara stepped forward. Funny, I was about to say the same. Briggs smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Last chance. Leave the land, and no one gets hurt." From my vantage point, I could see his men shifting in their saddles, fingers brushing the grips of their pistols. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a distraction. "Rose," I whispered, knowing she'd hear me from her position. The first shot came from the upstairs window. Elsie, clean and fast, taking the hat clean off one of the riders' heads. Before the shock wore off, Rose fired, the blast of the shotgun scattering another man's horse. I put my own round through the third rider's arm, sending him tumbling into the dirt. Briggs didn't flinch. He simply ducked behind the fence post and drew his revolver, firing 2 quick shots toward the porch. One splintered the railing inches from Clara's leg, the other cracked against the wall near the door. The yard exploded into chaos, horses screaming, men shouting, the air thick with gun smoke. I kept firing from the loft, forcing them to stay low, but Briggs moved like a man who'd done this 100 times. He fired once at the barn, and the bullet missed me by less than an inch, the splinters stinging my cheek. Then I saw it, a flicker of movement to the far left. Another rider, one we hadn't counted, creeping in along the dry creek bed. He had a clear line to the porch, and Clara didn't see him. I swung the rifle, squeezed the trigger, and watched him drop from the saddle. But the shot gave away my position. Briggs turned, aimed, and fired. The impact slammed into my side like a hammer. I went down hard, breath ripped from my lungs. For a moment, all I could hear was the ringing in my ears and the pounding of my own heartbeat. Somehow, through the haze, I heard Clara's voice, sharp and commanding. Then Rose's shotgun roared again, followed by the sound of retreating hoofbeats. When I blinked my eyes clear, the yard was empty except for the dust settling in the evening light. Briggs and his men were gone. For now. Clara knelt beside me, pressing a cloth to my side. Her face was pale but steady. "You're lucky," she said. "An inch higher and you'd be meeting my father in the next world." I managed a grim smile. "Then I guess we both have unfinished business." The sun had barely dipped below the horizon when we finally settled back into the house. My side throbbed with every breath, and each movement sent fresh pain lancing through my ribs. Clara had patched me up as best she could, but I knew I needed proper care soon, and I wasn't about to let the enemy catch me off guard again. Rose and Elsie were tense, pacing like cornered wolves. We all knew Briggs wasn't done. He'd come back, angrier, and with more men. That night, while the others rested, I stayed on the porch under the thin moonlight, rifle across my lap, eyes scanning the shadows beyond the tree line. Clara joined me quietly, handing me a cup of weak tea. "They'll strike at dawn," she said softly. "Briggs doesn't lose easily, and he's desperate now. Then we need to be ready." I thought about the map we'd spread out earlier. The marked trails, the hidden paths, and the old mining tunnels beneath the hills. We can use the land to our advantage. Fight them on our terms. She nodded. We also need allies. The town was a cage. Corrupt officials, a bought sheriff, and scared townsfolk. But not everyone was silent. There were whispers in the saloons, murmurs from the general storekeepers, and glances that lingered a second too long when the bank's name came up. If we could expose the corruption, bring in someone from outside, things might change. That was easier said than done. The bank's reach was long, and its grip tight. Over the next few days, we worked quietly, repairing fences, reinforcing the barn, and scouting the terrain. I kept my wounded side hidden from the others, but every movement reminded me how close I'd come to death. One evening, as we prepared a meager meal, a figure appeared on the ridge. Tall, lean, and riding with the steady gait of a man who knew these lands well. It was Jed Collins, the rider from the bank, but something was different. His face was tired, and his eyes held an uncertainty I hadn't seen before. Clara met him at the gate, wary but composed. I stayed in the shadows, watching. "I'm not here to bring trouble," Jed said quietly. "There's a way out of this, for all of us." Briggs's reign wasn't as unshakable as it seemed. And maybe, just maybe, even the worst men had cracks in their armor. Jed's arrival shifted the air around us like a sudden gust. For days, we had lived in a bubble of suspicion and tension, each shadow a potential enemy. Now, here was a man from the bank itself, claiming he wanted to help dismantle the corruption he'd been part of. It wasn't easy to trust him. He'd been the bank's eyes and ears, a messenger of threats and foreclosures. But desperation breeds strange alliances. In the dim light of the kitchen, Jed laid out what he knew. Names, dates, payments, and lies. I've seen how deep the rot goes, he admitted. Sheriff Morrison, Judge Stevens, even some town council members, they're all in on it. Clara listened without interrupting, her eyes sharp and unreadable. They think they own this valley, Jed continued. But they don't know we're planning to expose them. I've got contacts in the territorial capital who can help, but we need proof. That's when Clarabelle pulled out the envelope of bank records she'd stolen months ago. The weight of those papers felt heavier than any rifle. 4 hours, we plotted. We'd send Ruby with the documents to the capital, while the rest of us held the fort. Jed promised to stall Briggs and his men, buying time with half-truths and false leads. The tension mounted like a drawn bow. Every sound outside made us jump. Footsteps, distant horses, even the creak of a door. But there was no turning back now. As night fell, we prepared for the final battle, not just for land, but for justice itself. The night wrapped the valley in a shroud so thick it was almost a living thing. The stars blinked cold and distant, uncaring witnesses to the storm that was about to break. Inside the farmhouse, we moved quietly, shadows among shadows. Every creak of the wooden floor, every whisper of the wind through the cracks in the walls seemed to echo like a warning. I could feel the weight of the rifle slung across my back and the steady thump of my own heartbeat, steady but tense, keeping time with the slow tick of the old clock on the mantel. Clara, Rose, Elsie, and Jed had been coordinating since sundown, and the air was thick with unspoken determination. Tonight was the night we would either reclaim what was ours or lose everything forever. Ruby had ridden out hours ago, a ghost slipping through the darkness toward the territorial capital with the damning documents that could bring down the entire corrupt network. The clock was ticking. We had maybe 24 hours before Briggs and his men realized what had happened and came down hard. The front door creaked, and I stiffened, every nerve on edge. Clara motioned for silence as she slipped toward the window, peering through the darkness. Her eyes narrowed. Look. At the edge of the clearing, the first shadows moved. 6 men on horseback, slow and deliberate, their horses kicking up little puffs of dust in the moonlight. Briggs was among them, the scar on his jaw catching a faint glint of silver under his hat brim. His eyes scanned the farmhouse like a predator sizing up its prey. I ducked back into the house, heart pounding. They're here, I said low, gripping the rifle tighter. Rose's shotgun was loaded, Elsie's pistols gleamed in the lantern light, and Jed tightened his jaw. The silence was a promise of the violence to come. Briggs's voice carried over the clearing, sharp and mocking. You've got something that belongs to me. Hand it over, and I might let you walk away. Clara stepped onto the porch, her rifle resting in her hands. You want a fight? You'll get one. The first shot cracked through the still night, the sound of war erupting. Horses screamed and men shouted as bullets tore through the air. I fired from the loft, picking off the riders as they tried to advance. Briggs was relentless. He charged the porch, firing with deadly precision, each shot echoing like a gunshot to my chest. I felt the heat of a bullet pass close, splintering the wood near Clara's feet. The battle raged for what felt like hours, a brutal dance of smoke, steel, and blood. We lost ground, but we also made them pay for every inch. The air was thick with dust and gunpowder, and the screams of men and horses alike filled the night. At one point, Briggs broke through the line, barreling toward me with a snarl. I met him with a burst from my rifle, and he fell from his horse, rolling into the dirt. But the fight was far from over. More riders appeared from the shadows, reinforcements called in by the bank's network. The sheriff himself rode at their head, a cruel smile on his lips. It was clear then, the entire town was against us. But we were fighting for more than land or money. We were fighting for truth, for justice, for the memory of those who'd been wronged. Bloodied and exhausted, we made a desperate retreat through the back trails Clara had shown me. The narrow paths twisted through the rocky hills, every step a gamble with death. The sounds of pursuit thundered behind us. We split up as planned, Ruby racing toward the capital with the documents, and the rest of us weaving through the canyons, shadows fading into the night. As dawn broke, the valley was silent again, but the war was far from over. We had bought time, but at a terrible cost. Wounded but unbroken, we gathered at a hidden cabin deep in the hills. The papers were safe, Ruby was out there fighting for justice, and the fight had only just begun. The hidden cabin smelled of pine and smoke, a refuge carved from the relentless wilderness. We huddled close inside, the cool morning light barely touching the dusty windows. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken fears and raw exhaustion. The gunshot echoes from last night still haunted me, the smell of burnt gunpowder and blood lingering in the air like a curse. We had survived, yes, but the enemy had not relented. They were closing in, their corruption deeper than we had imagined. I looked around the room. Clara's eyes were sharp despite the dark circles under them, Rose's hands trembled as she cleaned her shotgun, and Elsie sat quietly, her face a mask of determination. Jed was staring at the floor, wrestling with the weight of his betrayal. "This isn't just about us anymore," Jed finally spoke, breaking the silence. "The bank's been bleeding this land dry for years. They've got officials, lawmen, even judges in their pocket. They control everything." I nodded grimly. "That's why we need to be smarter. We can't just fight fire with fire. We need proof, allies, and a plan that hits them where it hurts." Clara pulled out the envelope Ruby had given her before the ride to the capital, a treasure trove of forged deeds, bribery records, and letters linking the bank's top brass to crooked sheriffs and judges. "We send this to the territorial marshal," Clara said. "If he's honest, he'll act. But getting him to listen won't be easy." The room fell silent. We all knew how dangerous it was to trust anyone in this town, let alone officials. Suddenly, a soft knock came at the door. We froze, hands reaching for weapons. Rose whispered, "Who is it?" A man stepped inside, cautious but determined. His clothes were worn, but his eyes burned with quiet fury. "I'm Thomas," he said. "I work at the general store in town. I've seen what the bank's done, people losing homes, families torn apart. I want to help." Hope flickered in the room like a fragile flame. We shared our story, the evidence, the fight, and the desperate ride to the capital. Thomas listened carefully, then nodded. "I know others," he said. "People who want change but are afraid. Maybe we can rally them." For the first time in days, I felt the weight of despair lift just a little. We began planning, not just to survive, but to strike back. To expose the bank, the sheriff, and everyone complicit in the land theft. To bring justice to the valley. The next steps would be the hardest. But we had something they didn't, a truth worth fighting for, and a growing band of allies willing to risk everything. The night air was thick with anticipation as we prepared to move. The cabin had become a fortress of hope, but we knew it was only a matter of time before the bank's men found us. Our ragtag group had grown. Thomas had brought others, people tired of fear and ready to stand up for their land and their lives. We moved silently through the shadows, the moon a sliver of cold silver in the sky. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig made my heart pound like a drum in my chest. The stakes had never been higher. This wasn't just about property anymore. It was about reclaiming justice from the jaws of corruption. Clara led the way, her sharp eyes scanning the darkness. Rose followed, shotgun at the ready, while Elsie and Jed brought up the rear. I stayed in the center, keeping the group tight. Thomas and the others moved quietly beside us, ready to fight for a future they barely dared to imagine. We had one goal, to reach the territorial marshal with the evidence and force him to act. The bank's stranglehold on the town was suffocating, but the capital might be our last chance to break free. The journey was brutal. Rocky paths and narrow trails tested our endurance, and the ever-present threat of ambush kept our senses razor-sharp. We camped in hidden hollows, sharing whispered stories and cautious hopes beneath the cold stars. As we neared the capital, the tension was palpable. The city was a sprawling web of politics and power, a world away from the quiet desperation of the valley. We knew that even here, corruption might have its claws, but this was where the law still had a chance to hold. Inside the marshal's office, we laid out the documents, the forged deeds, the ledger of bribes, the letters linking powerful men to the land theft scheme. The marshal, a stern but fair man named Davidson, listened without interrupting. His eyes darkened as he read. "This is beyond corruption," he said quietly. "It's organized crime. We'll need to move carefully. But I swear, this ends now." Back in the valley, Briggs and his gang weren't idle. They tightened their grip, sending men to hunt us down, burning homes, and silencing dissent. The town was a powder keg ready to explode. We couldn't wait for the law to move alone. We gathered our allies, ordinary people with nothing left to lose, and prepared for a final stand. This was our home, and we would fight to the last breath. The days that followed were a whirlwind of preparation and tension. Messages passed in secret, weapons hidden, plans drawn in the dirt. Every neighbor was a potential friend, or foe. The night before the confrontation, I stood outside, looking up at the stars, feeling the weight of what was to come. We were 4 against an army of greed and lies, but we had something stronger: truth, courage, and the will to fight for justice. The night before the reckoning felt endless. Hours stretched like the desert horizon at sunset, slow and burning with the weight of what was to come. We gathered in the dim light of the barn, the scent of hay mingling with gun oil and sweat. Faces once filled with fear now showed a grim resolve. This was no longer just a fight for land, it was a battle for every soul that had been crushed by lies and greed. Ruby paced quietly, running over the plan again, her voice low but firm. We would hold the farmhouse as our stronghold, using the terrain to our advantage. Ambush points were marked, signals agreed upon. Every man, woman, and child who dared to stand with us had a role. The tension was thick, a silent storm waiting to break. Clara checked her rifle with steady hands, eyes flicking toward the door every time a shadow moved. Rose loaded her shotgun, the heavy shells clicking softly but with finality. Elsie and Jed shared a glance, partners in more ways than one, bound by a cause greater than themselves. I found myself staring at the forged deeds and documents spread across the rough table, proof of the bank's treachery. These papers held the key to everything, and we would use them to bring down the monstrous web of corruption once and for all. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the distant sounds of horses and low voices. Briggs was gathering his forces for the final push. We knew this night would decide everything. As midnight struck, a figure slipped through the shadows. Thomas, the general store clerk, returning with news. "They're coming," he said, voice barely a whisper but loaded with urgency. "More than we thought. They've got reinforcements from the neighboring counties." A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't just a local fight anymore. The bank's reach was spreading like wildfire, and if we didn't stop it now, there would be no safe place left. We fortified our defenses, barricading doors and windows, setting traps along the perimeter. Everyone moved with a purpose, every heartbeat a drumbeat in the symphony of war. The hours dragged, every second a test of endurance and will. Then, just before dawn, the first shots rang out, a deadly chorus shattering the fragile quiet. The battle erupted with a fury none of us had fully prepared for. Bullets tore through the air, splinters of wood flew, and cries echoed across the valley. We fought with everything we had, every ounce of strength and courage. Briggs led the charge, a whirlwind of rage and violence. But we held our ground, matching his fury with unyielding resolve. Ruby's rifle cracked with precision, Clara's steady aim took down riders before they could close in, and Rose's shotgun blasts cleared paths through the enemy lines. The farmhouse was a battleground, every room a fortress, every hallway a trap. Jed moved like a shadow, protecting the wounded and rallying the defenders. Elsie's pistols flashed, her determination unbreakable. The fight stretched into hours, the sun climbing higher but the battle showing no sign of letting up. Bodies fell on both sides, but the tide began to turn. The bank's men, once confident, now faltered in the face of our resistance. Then, a sound that lifted our spirits, a distant whistle, sharp and clear. Ruby had returned with reinforcements, a small but determined posse led by the territorial marshal himself. The arrival of the law turned the tide. The marshal, reading the damning evidence, ordered the arrest of Briggs, the sheriff, and the corrupt officials. Chains clinked, guns were lowered, and the long shadow of corruption finally began to lift. We stood together in the wreckage, battered but victorious. The valley was scarred, but it was ours again, free from the bank's grasp. The fight wasn't easy, and the road ahead would still be hard, but justice had found a foothold. As the sun rose over the hills, I looked around at the faces of my unlikely family. Ruby, Clara, Rose, Elsie, Jed, and all those who had stood with us. We had faced the darkness and come out into the light. This was more than a victory. It was a new beginning. The aftermath of the battle left the valley cloaked in a restless quiet, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if justice would truly take root. The broken fences and scorched earth bore witness to the fierce struggle, but more importantly, the scars marked the beginning of a new chapter for all of us. Despite the marshal's presence and the arrests of Briggs, Sheriff Morrison, and the corrupt officials, the air remained thick with tension. The town's wounds were far from healed. Whispers of retaliation haunted every shadowed alley and closed storefront. We had won the fight, but the war for the valley's soul was just beginning. Inside the farmhouse, we gathered, our family, forged in fire and blood. Ruby sat quietly, her eyes reflecting both exhaustion and a fierce determination that seemed to burn brighter than ever. Clara meticulously cleaned her rifle, a habit she had never abandoned even in the brief moments of peace. Rose and Elsie exchanged looks that spoke volumes about the trust and unspoken bonds formed in battle. Jed, usually the quiet one, shared tales of old days, his voice a balm to frayed nerves. I stood by the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The land stretched out before us, free, but fragile. Our victory was a beacon, but the darkness still lingered in corners unseen. The evidence we handed to the marshal had ignited investigations that reached far beyond our valley. More arrests came in waves, exposing a sprawling network of corruption that stretched into distant towns and powerful cities. The bank's once untouchable grip began to crumble, piece by piece. But that victory came at a price. Families lost homes, friendships fractured, and the line between friend and foe blurred in the haze of conflict. We bore those losses deeply, but the resolve to rebuild burned even stronger. One evening, as we sat around the fire outside the farmhouse, Thomas spoke quietly about what lay ahead. The fight for justice doesn't end with locking up a few criminals. We need to build a future where no one can exploit the land or its people again. Ruby nodded, her voice steady. We must restore trust. Help those who lost everything to rise again. Teach the next generation the value of this land and the courage it takes to protect it. Clara added, and keep watching. The shadows may hide new threats, but we'll be ready. The days turned into weeks. Slowly, the valley began to heal. Neighbors reopened their shops, children's laughter returned to the dusty streets, and the scent of fresh earth after rain filled the air with promise. Together, we rebuilt fences, replanted crops, and restored the heart of the land that had sustained generations before us. Through it all, our bond grew unbreakable. What started as strangers bound by circumstance had become family, keepers of a legacy rooted in resilience and hope. One morning, standing on the porch, I felt the weight of everything we had endured and overcome. The road had been long and perilous, but it led us here, to a place where justice wasn't just a dream but a living, breathing truth. As the sun rose, casting golden light across the valley, I realized that home wasn't just a place. It was the people who stood with you, the battles you fought together, and the hope that never died. Our story wasn't just about a fight for land, it was a testament to courage, to standing tall when the world tried to break you, and to the unyielding spirit that defines the Wild West. And in that spirit, we moved forward, ready to face whatever the horizon held next. The dawn broke slowly over the valley, a heavy silence lingering in the cool morning air that felt more like a breath held before a storm than a peaceful awakening. I stood on the porch of the farmhouse, the place that had become my home, my battleground, and the crucible where we'd forged something stronger than fear or greed. The weight of the past weeks pressed down on my shoulders, but beneath it, a fierce fire burned, a fire for justice, for truth, and for a future we could finally believe in. Around me, Ruby, Clara, Rose, and Elsie prepared quietly, their faces set with the determination that had carried us through every impossible moment. Jed checked his guns with methodical calm, but I could see the tension in his jaw. This was it. The final chapter in a story none of us wanted to write, but all of us had lived. We knew the bank's remaining allies hadn't given up. Even with the marshal's intervention and the arrests, the shadows still stretched deep. There were whispers that the man in the expensive suit, Jonathan Kessler, was pulling strings from behind bars, sending messages through corrupted deputies and hired guns who hadn't yet felt the sting of justice. Our intelligence was clear. They were planning one last attempt to snatch the valley from our hands, an all-out assault to wipe us out, erase our proof, and crush the rebellion before it could spread. As the first light cracked across the hills, signaling the day's start, a rider appeared on the ridge, kicking up dust in the cold air. It was Ruby's signal, reinforcements from the marshal's office, and allies from neighboring towns who had taken a stand against the corruption that had poisoned our lands. We had gathered nearly 50 souls, farmers, ranchers, former victims of the bank schemes, and a handful of mercenaries who believed in the cause. It was a ragtag army, but every man and woman carried the weight of loss and hope alike, ready to fight for what was rightfully theirs. The bank's forces arrived moments later, well-armed, brutal, and ruthless. Briggs and the sheriff's loyalists, released on temporary bail with promises of silence, had regrouped. Their eyes gleamed with desperation and hatred. This was their last shot. The valley became a stage for a battle that felt bigger than any of us. A battle for the soul of the West, for honor, for home. The first volley of gunfire shattered the dawn's quiet. Horses reared, men shouted orders, and the ground trembled under the pounding hooves and marching feet. Bullets tore through the air, wood splintered under rifle fire, and the acrid smell of gunpowder mingled with the dust. I fought beside Ruby, her rifle steady and sure, picking off enemies before they could close in. Clara and Rose flanked us, their shots precise and deadly. Elsie covered our rear, moving with a lethal grace that belied her quiet demeanor. Jed was everywhere, patching wounds, rallying faltering fighters, and never once losing sight of the enemy. The fight stretched on, brutal and unforgiving. The bank's men had numbers, but we had heart, and the righteous fury of those who refused to be crushed. At one point, I found myself face to face with Briggs, the man who had led the campaign to steal our lands and crush our spirits. His eyes burned with madness as he raised his gun. Time slowed, the crack of his shot deafened the world around me. But fate had other plans. A sharp whistle cut through the chaos, and a bullet from Clara's rifle stopped Briggs cold. The tide turned swiftly after that. Our enemies faltered, confusion and fear breaking their ranks. The marshal's reinforcements surged forward, rounding up stragglers, securing the field. When the smoke cleared, silence returned, heavy and absolute. The valley lay battered, but victorious. Among the ruins, I stood with my family, Ruby, Clara, Rose, Elsie, Jed, and the faces of those who had suffered alongside us. We looked at one another, eyes filled with exhaustion and triumph. But victory was more than a moment, it was a new beginning. In the weeks that followed, the valley blossomed anew. The bank's empire crumbled beneath the weight of truth and justice. Jonathan Kessler, Sheriff Morrison, Briggs, and all the corrupt were sentenced to prison. Their ill-gotten fortunes were seized, redistributed to those they had robbed. The land was restored to its rightful owners, families who had waited decades to reclaim what was theirs. New laws were passed to protect property rights and prevent such abuse from ever happening again. We rebuilt homes, schools, and churches. The dusty streets filled once more with laughter, trade, and life. And through it all, we remembered those we lost, heroes who gave everything for the valley's future. One evening, standing once again on that porch, I watched the sun set over fields of golden wheat and thriving gardens. Ruby joined me, her hand finding mine. "This land, it's more than soil and fences," she said softly. "It's our legacy, our fight, our home." I nodded. "And we'll protect it. Together." The stars emerged, bright and countless above us, silent witnesses to a promise forged in fire and sealed in blood. Our story was one of courage, resilience, and the unbreakable spirit of those who stand for what's right. In the wild expanse of the West, where law once bent to greed, we carved out a place for justice and hope. And for the first time in a long time, the valley was truly free. If you were in his shoes, would you have fought the same fight? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Don't forget to like the video and explore the other stories waiting for you on the screen now. Thanks for riding along with us. Until the next adventure.